Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. Martin, and this is the final section of the novel 910 by Nora Raleigh Baskin. This section occurs 1 year after September 11th, 2001, and the author has chosen to do something kind of interesting here. She's closing the book the way she started it, with all of our characters at one location. And that one location is Ground Zero in New York City. Ground Zero is the name that was given to the World Trade Center after the attacks. And it's important to note that if you were to go to this location today, there is a beautiful memorial to the lives lost on that day. But 1 year later, that memorial did not exist. As a matter of fact, 1 year later, all it really was some flat ground and some piles of rubble that still needed to be cleared. It literally took months and months and months to clean up the wreckage from the attacks. So anybody who was going to this location the year later wasn't going there to see anything really. They were going there to commemorate the lives that were lost. At first, it had been exciting, like being famous. Certainly, it was as close to being famous as pretty much anyone from Shanksville had ever been. There were news vans set up like permanent trailer parks, surrounding the strip mine, outside the school, and along U.S. Route 30. There were satellite dishes and food trucks and news people everywhere. There were people who just felt they had to come to see the site of such a tragedy and pay some kind of respect to those who had died. So if we're looking for a clue as to whose perspective we are in, there's your clue. This is Will. And Will is talking about the change in his town since the accident occurred, since the crash of Flight 93. There were the others, the conspiracy theorists, the morbidly curious, the wannabes, and the just plain crazy. And then there were the families and friends of the victims of 9/11 and Flight 93, who came almost immediately after the crash, whose swollen eyes were ringed with black circles, whose hearts were cracked open and torn apart. They had come looking for an answer or a story or a piece of something, anything to take away with them. But there was nothing. No answers, no closure, nothing to take away. So instead, they left something. They left stuffed animals, notes, ribbons, pieces of clothing, books, flowers, Bibles, flattened pennies, poems, photographs, jewelry, tiny trinkets. They tied their objects, their hearts, their sorrow to the 40-foot chain-link fence that had been installed at the crash site. They wrote things on the tall white boards that had been put up for that purpose. So this is kind of an interesting idea that people who went there were heartbroken and they wanted to leave something because they could not take something away. And this word, closure, it's a tricky word. What it really means is the idea that emotionally you've left something with some sense of completion or answers. And for the loved ones who survived the loss of the people on 9/11, there is no closure. There are no satisfying answers. There is no sense of completion, particularly for the people who lost loved ones who could not have a funeral for them because there was nothing left to bury. So for these people, they decided what they would do is leave mementos. And this, if you recall in the Flight 93 memorial film that I shared with you, this is something that still goes on to this day. So, we're 20 years later and there are still people leaving items and mementos at the crash site of Flight 93. Now, at this point, there are actually shelves built into the wall that surround the crash site where you are encouraged to leave things if you so choose. But, at this time, there was really nothing there but a fence to keep people from, getting into the debris field because there were still investigations going on as to what actually happened. So this is a very slow, painful process of trying to arrive at closure, and a lot of people simply never got there. All kinds of people, hundreds a day, driving down roads that a year ago only a few cars and a couple of kids on their bicycles had traveled. For a while, Will's sisters set up camp on their front lawn just to give directions to all the visitors who inevitably made a wrong turn or two. They dragged out a folding table and a chair and hung a sign, free directions. They took turns sitting there for weeks, until the grass under their chair turned brown, until even they got overwhelmed by all the people, the endless stream of lost, broken-hearted, patriotic, curious people. So much it wore a path in the streets and across everyone's hearts, threatening to obliterate everything else. So we see that Rooney and Callie have found a way to be helpful and useful, but eventually they get overwhelmed as well. And this pain, this sadness that these visitors brought with them threatens to obliterate everything else. Obliterate means to block out. So the feelings that these visitors, who really the girls were just giving directions to, the pain that they were in, the sadness they brought with them, it rubs off on you. It makes you feel sad. And so for two little girls who are just trying to be helpful, that may have gotten to be too much. And this, the 1-year anniversary, only promised to bring more interlopers. It was an opportune time, Will's mother had decided, for the family to get out of town, far from Somerset County, away from the crowds that had taken over Shanksville. Interlopers are visitors who are not invited. So the visitors that are, have been streaming into the town since the crash of Flight 93, it's only going to increase for the anniversary. And so Will's mom decides they should leave. And where else to escape the crowds? To New York City. Seriously? But Will knew why his mother had wanted to come. She had been awarded tickets to the 9/11 memorial service for her charity work, because she had spent the better part of the entire last year helping to set up a temporary memorial. She was in charge of cataloging every single item that was left behind or mailed to Shanksville. No object was too small or invaluable for her attention. Not a water-soaked matchbook, not a box of broken crayons, not an empty wallet with barely visible initials stamped into one corner. So this idea of tickets to the memorial service had to be done because there was very little flat space in the actual ground zero area. And it was all fenced off because, again, they were still clearing the piles. It was still dangerous. There was still rubble and wreckage. So they could only have a limited number of people. And these tickets were distributed to family members of those who had died in the Twin Towers. And so the way it was set up was that they would be able to go in through the fence, and there were some chairs set up, and that was pretty much it. There was a podium, a microphone, and the idea behind the memorial service was that the family and loved ones and friends of those who had passed away would read their names starting at 8:46 in the morning to commemorate the loss of their lives. And so this kind of memorial service, this was something that a lot of people wanted to go to. A lot of people wanted to, again, try to find closure, try to get some emotional answers out of what was going on. But it was a very limited size space. So tickets were very rare and hard to come by. Will's mother had been, again, like her daughters, being helpful. She was cataloging all of the items that were sent to Shanksville or were left behind. So she was one of the first people who was helping to build a memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And so these tickets were kind of an honor to show her appreciation and gratitude because she had done such wonderful work. And so Will knew that this was significant to her, that she'd be able to use those tickets because she had been given them for her selflessness. With each recorded memento of grief, Will's mother found hope, and Will's family began to heal. The heroes of Flight 93 affected Will's family in a different way than they might have affected someone else's family. The people in that plane were heroes in the most important way, making a choice, not knowing the outcome, but knowing that acting was better than not acting. Doing the right thing because the right thing was what you were supposed to do. Only this time, the whole country was mourning with Will's family. So there's a lot of good stuff in this paragraph, because what we see here is something that's ironic. Remember that irony is the opposite of what we would expect to have happen. Will's family began to heal in the midst of everyone else's pain. And part of the reason why is because they weren't alone in their grief. Everyone in the whole country was mourning. And so they finally felt understood. They finally felt like somebody else could connect to their loss. And helping other people overcome and cope with that grief helped them to heal, because they had already had a year's head start on developing those coping skills. Because grief and loss, it's a process, and it's not something that ever really goes away, but you start to develop the coping skills and the strategies to deal with it. And so Will's mother, his sisters, even Will himself, they've got experience. And so seeing other people grieve, they feel useful, they feel helpful. The other thing that is worth noting is that Will shares that the people in the plane were heroes in the most important way because they made a choice, they didn't know the outcome, and they knew that acting was better than not acting. Who else did that? Who else gave their life without knowing the outcome? That would be Mr. Rittenhouse, Will's dad. So, in a way, this helps Will come to peace with the way his dad's life ended. So, this is, finally a moment where Will can recognize his dad was heroic. And this echoes something that Will's father had said to him in the section about the birthday party. Doing the right thing because it was the right thing, and that's what you are supposed to do. So finally, Will's father's words and advice are making sense to Will. Rooney and Callie just seemed excited to be in New York City. They all had taken the train yesterday from Johnstown to Penn Station and found their room at the Milford Hotel right in Times Square. The entire day they had acted like regular tourists. They walked 4 across along Broadway, craning their necks, looking up at the giant billboards and down at the rows of window displays, cameras, suitcases, New York City memorabilia, clothing stores, makeup stores. On Fifth Avenue, there were entire stores devoted to just one designer, to sunglasses, to Nike, to NBA, which, of course, Will wanted to go to, and his sisters didn't complain too much about. If this was the only part of New York City a person came to, he might never know any different. The city was alive with shopping and sightseeing, smells of steaming hot dogs and salty pretzels on every block, vendors selling hats, selling pocketbooks, selling photographs. "Look, Mom." Callie stopped and pointed. A man sat on a tiny folding stool before a trifold display of photographs, mostly of the New York skyline. "These photos will be worth a fortune one day," the man took the opportunity to say. "Photos of the World Trade Center. I took them myself." Will scrunched up his face. That didn't seem likely. He had seen the exact same photo at another guy's booth a block away. "No, thank you," Will's mother said. This morning, Wednesday, September 11th, they had to be downtown by 8 o'clock. The reading of the names would begin at the exact time the first plane struck the first tower, 8:46. There were sure to be crowds. They were sure to have trouble with the subway map. They were sure to get lost at least once. So they left the hotel at 7 in the morning and arrived at ground zero in plenty of time. So these dots aren't going to mark a shift in time in this section. They're going to mark a shift in perspective. So our next section isn't necessarily going to be from a specific character. We're going to get that outside factual narrator voice now, because again, our author is trying to weave the factual reality of the situation into a fictional book. Some people will say that the distance a person happened to be from where one of the planes went down is in direct proportion to how deeply they were affected by the events of a day that came to be known simply as 9/11. For instance, people who lived in Lower Manhattan were more a part of the tragedy than those who happened to be on the Upper West Side, than those who lived in Westchester, or who were in school in upstate New York, or who called Seattle, Washington home. But that isn't true. So this actually was something that people had theorized, because if you lived in Lower Manhattan, you really couldn't avoid the smoke and the ash and the sight of the wreckage every single day of your life as you left your home. Whereas if you lived in Rockland County or Westchester County, you didn't have to see those things every day. But there were people from all over the world that died that day. And it really undercut those connections. Because if you knew someone, if you lost someone, if you loved someone who's no longer with you because of that event, that loss cuts deep. It does not matter what your geographical location is. And some people point to the number of deaths, more than 2,700, at the World Trade Center, 343 of them firefighters, 246 in 4 places, 125 in the Pentagon, citizens from over 90 different countries. But that doesn't quite tell the story either. Because in the end, it was just about people. Mothers, fathers, friends, foes, sisters, brothers, children born and not yet born, sons and daughters. People from all over the United States and then all over the globe, whose lives would never be the same. Because the world changed that day, slowly, and then all at once. There were stories, so many stories. They started appearing immediately everywhere in New York. Stapled, taped, thumbtacked all over the city. Photographs and photocopies, flyers, letters, sticky notes, and desperate pleas. Please. Please, have you seen this woman, this man? In the aftermath of the fallen towers, thousands of people were missing. Thousands. The city became a giant scrapbook, a living, breathing, weeping album of the missing. Every telephone pole, the side of every building, every tree had become a collage of faces, an entreaty to understand, to share, and to find answers and mourn. So there is that word again, closure. People are looking for answers. Now, what's really tragic is, and there are definitely still pictures of this, with so many people missing, because when the towers fell, obviously, the people inside, their bodies could not be rescued. Their bodies could not be returned to their families. There were people who believed that maybe their loved ones survived, and they believed that maybe their loved ones had been taken to a hospital. Maybe they had amnesia. Maybe they were in a coma. Maybe they were unable to speak for some reason, and people had just not contacted the family yet. And so there were flyers and photocopies of pictures and notes with people's names and their family addresses and things like that, literally all over everything. Mailboxes, newspaper, vending machines, in the subway station, above ground, on fences, buildings, you name it. Everything was kind of wallpapered with these pictures and these photocopies and these notes, because people were desperate to find their loved ones. And unfortunately, in some cases, that simply did not happen. So, for instance, the memorial service that I attended for Mike Roberts ended up with us just laying to rest his uniform because there was really nothing left of him to bury. So this is a very real phenomena, and our author gives it to us in the midst of a fictional account. But again, this is a way of helping us to connect to the reality of what actually happened that day. Amy's mother hadn't been able to get a flight home to Los Angeles until that Friday. And when she did, she said it was like entering a military zone. At JFK Airport, Army personnel were everywhere. No one in line spoke above a whisper. Scheduled flights were delayed by hours. Security took an unprecedented length of time. The flight itself was terrifying. But on Saturday morning when Amy woke up, her mother was standing in her bedroom doorway. And a year later, they had decided to return together for the 1-year anniversary. So this was also true because the TSA, which exists now in every airport, did not exist at this time. The military, the Army, was doing that job in airports. So because this was immediately afterwards, they didn't have time to hire and train and get people ready to serve that purpose of this enhanced security. The military did that part. And for my husband, who flew a few weeks after 9/11, he said it was intense because there was, military, and there were, bomb sniffing dogs, and, there was a heavy police presence. I mean, there was a lot of intense focus on securing airports because people never wanted to see this happen again. So interestingly, this impacts Amy's family enough that they want to return for the 1-year anniversary. Why? Because if it was not for Amy's phone call, Amy could have lost her mom. Her mom was literally scheduled to be in that building. So out of gratitude, out of sorrow, out of solidarity, they decided to return. Now, it's worth noting that the real-life firm, Cantor Fitzgerald, they lost 75% of the people who worked for them that day, including one of the partners who ran the firm. The other partner miraculously survived. Why? Because his son was entering kindergarten, and he wanted to take his son to his first day of school. So that goes to show you where the inspiration for Amy's storyline comes from, because there were so many stories of people who were supposed to be at the World Trade Center, who were supposed to be in Lower Manhattan, who were supposed to be at Ground Zero, but something stopped them. Something happened that diverted their path, and they miraculously survived. And so there's a lot of speculation as to, why that happened or how that happened. How did these people get so lucky when so many others did not? And that's really what Amy's story represents. Sergio would be there, of course. Gideon had gotten him an extra ticket from the guys at Engine 209, Ladder Company 10, to attend the ceremony at Ground Zero inside the roped-off area, right on the flat expanse of dirt where the Twin Towers once stood. Sergio needed to be there. He wanted to. So much had happened in a year. Now, I don't know about you, but I was relieved to see that name. Gideon survived. And through the rest of this section, we'll get a little bit of detail about Sergio's life over the past year and his bond with Gideon. But the idea that Gideon survived definitely was a little bit of a relief to me as a reader, because I like that guy. It wasn't going to be a holiday, not like President's Day or MLK Day, so there was still school that Wednesday, but it was called Patriot Day. And he was given permission to miss school. His grandmother wanted to go with him, and they both stood for nearly an hour before they could even get in. Apparently, a lady was going to play the flute, and one after another, relatives of those who were killed were going to walk up onto the stage and read the names, nearly 3,000, out loud. Many of Gideon's friends were among them. Gideon himself was going to be one of the readers. This last year, Sergio had spent a lot of time at the firehouse, and Gideon had even come to visit them in Red Hook. Sergio's grandmother made them dinner, and the three of them stuffed themselves and watched Jeopardy on television afterward. Gideon helped Sergio with his homework, not that Sergio needed it. Gideon taught him basic first aid, and when Sergio had a test in biology, they studied together. And in a funny way, having Gideon in his life and knowing what had happened to the country made Sergio less angry at his father and less angry at the world. It made him more afraid and less afraid, both. There was so much to mourn and so much to be proud of and so many reasons to be at this memorial. So here we get kind of an overview of what Sergio's relationship with Gideon has grown to be. Gideon helped with homework, taught him first aid, helped him study for tests. Gideon visited them in Red Hook. They had dinner together. They watched Jeopardy. It sounds like Gideon has made himself part of Sergio's family. And so what's powerful about that is, like Will, this has made Sergio less angry and less frustrated with his own life circumstances. And so, yeah, maybe Sergio didn't get the best dad in the world by birth, but family very often is the people we choose to surround ourselves with as we get older. And so Gideon kind of fills that dad or big brother role in Sergio's life. He doesn't have that emptiness that Paul left behind any longer. We have our three little dots. And so for us, this marks a shift, and this will now lead us to Naheed. Naheed and her family were making the pilgrimage as well, all the way from Columbus, Ohio, even though there had been days this past year when they had all been afraid to leave their house. So we saw some positive development from Will and from Sergio based on the past year of their life, but for Naheed, there was no such thing. So let's read on. That afternoon, a year earlier, Naheed and her sister had walked home together nearly 2 full miles. Uncle Aman and Aunt Judith were still there and wouldn't be able to leave for weeks. Naheed's father was pulling into the driveway. Her mother had also left work early. She rushed into the house with tears in her eyes. She pulled her daughters close and held them there. So many people, she kept saying. So many people. She had the look on her face of a pain that was not her own, but was for the whole world. That look that most all grown-ups seemed to express in those following days. Naheed and Nori listened to and watched the television, but it all seemed too horrible to be real, and too far away to have any significant impact on them personally. Until a brick came sailing through the air a few weeks later, breaking glass and landing on their living room floor. So let's pause here for a second. Naheed's mother is showing what we call empathy. So that look that all the grown-ups had, that pain, which was not your own personal pain, but pain for someone else, that's empathy. Empathy is the ability, the skill, to see the world through someone else's eyes, to put yourself in someone else's position and allow yourself to feel their pain. And so empathy is something that, truly allows us to connect to other people, particularly when those people are in need. And so her mother is overwhelmed with empathy for these people's loss. And at first, Naheed and Nori are watching this on television, and it doesn't seem real to them because this is something, again, very difficult to wrap your brain around when you're watching it. But what made it feel real, what made it real for them, was what happened afterwards. Until a Middle Eastern restaurant in Columbus was targeted by a firebomb. It's owned by Israelis, for heaven's sake, Naheed's father kept saying. Until a gas station attendant in New Jersey was shot not a Muslim, but a Sikh from India, because he was wearing his traditional turban. And now, Naheed's parents were taking them to New York, right into the belly of the beast, to grieve with the rest of the country because her father vowed, "We are Americans, and no one is going to take that away from us." So I just want to point out to you, these examples are true. This actually happened. In these horrific instances of racism and murder in some cases. They happened in the backlash of fear and xenophobia that people had after September 11th. Now, I want to put this in perspective for you. This was not happening everywhere all the time. These were sad, tragic occurrences that did occur. But there was also a sense of outrage when these things happened, not just among the Islamic community, but among all Americans who felt there was enough pain and that at random acts of racism was in no way going to help anyone. Remember, as I mentioned to you in class, judging people, any large group of people, based on the misdeeds and the crimes of a few, it's a dangerous thing to do, and it's a foolish thing to do. Naheed and Nori and their family are as far removed from those terrorists as you could possibly get. Most Muslim families are peaceful, and that religion is beautiful. That culture, that heritage, it spans the test of time, and it gives many, many people a way and a guide to lead their lives in a positive way. We're talking about the twisted, demented acts of about 20 individuals. And so to judge and, in this sense, persecute people who had no connection to that demented way of believing, it was unjust. And it was a disservice to those who died that day because it desecrated what that day stood for their family and their loved ones. For so many complicated reasons, there would never be another morning simply beautiful as 9/11, 2001. People always talk about the weather when they don't have anything else to talk about, when the conversation is light or feels stilted, or someone is just too peaceful, lazy, or preoccupied to think about anything more taxing. But after that day, the weather and the way people remembered it became something more, something potentially more deceptive and yet something more meaningful, more fragile and rare, and even more beautiful. And so here the author is pointing out the irony, or the opposite of what we would expect, of the weather on September 11th, 2001. The weather was remarkable. And when I say it was remarkable, I mean it oddly, because we get different weather all over the country because we live in different regions, but the majority of the country had a gorgeous blue sky day. And so for the people in these areas that were affected, that weather seemed to be the opposite of what we would expect from a day of tragedy. Movies and TV shows have us set up to believe that when we emotionally experience tragedy, it's going to be thunderstorms outside and rain and dark weather, because it's reflecting what we feel. But in real life, that just does not happen. We're going to switch back now to Amy. Wednesday, September 11th, 2002, was sunny but not as clear, and the wind blew unrelentingly across Manhattan. Amy held tight to her mother's hand as they moved through the crowds. Her father walked close behind them. They finally found a spot and stood for a while on the platform on Fulton Street with the other people who had stopped walking, who had also come to be part of something larger than they were, something that drew them to this place even though they knew no one personally who had vanished into the white clouded air that day. They couldn't get any closer without a ticket, and the streets were roped off for blocks. So the idea was a lot of people came to Ground Zero, even without tickets, to this event, because even though they might not have known anyone personally who was lost that day, They wanted to feel connected to something larger than themselves. They wanted to help those who were mourning to feel like they weren't alone. Below, at the memorial, they could see those who were standing, the families of the victims holding flags, clutching flowers, holding photographs, holding babies in the air as if those looking down and those far above could see them, know, and feel. Could have been you, Mom, Amy whispered, because how many times had she wondered why and why not? Who gets a second chance, a third, a fourth, and why did someone get none at all? It had taken Amy a while to find the kind of girls that she felt comfortable with in her new school, and it wasn't that Bridget and Vanessa were enemies or anything. But Amy did not need that kind of drama, not after what she had been through. I want to go down there, Amy said. The warm air blew persistently, as if trying to drive away the sunshine. Above, the flags snapped like whips, and the crooning of the wind harmonized with the steady sound of human crying. That's just for family, her father said. I know, but I need to stand there or get a little closer at least for a second. For a full year, Amy hadn't wanted to let her mother out of her sight. She had nightmares and got stomach aches when her mother went away on trips. But now, Amy had to let go of her mother's hand and headed towards the line of people inside the velvet ropes. Her mother reached out to stop her. Let her go, her father said. We'll wait right here, Amy, he called out. We'll be right here. Don't be long. She turned back around once and nodded. She needed to let go, and she needed to grab on, and she needed to stand directly in the center of the universe that almost wasn't. So for her, the universe that almost wasn't would have been if her mother had passed away, because she would have been one of the people who was mourning that day. So for her, she wanted to make that connection. Now we shift back to Naheed. We don't have to stay long, but I want to be there. I just want to leave these. I need to show the world that we are Americans too. We can't be afraid, Naheed's mother said. She was clutching a spray of orchids wrapped in clear cellophane. There's a fence surrounding the platform. We can't get too close, but I know we can get there and leave these flowers. So for Naheed's mother, she is not allowing fear to dictate their lives, which is an important example for Naheed because you know this character by now. She is afraid of everything. So even though she's terrified to be in New York City, her parents' bravery is a great example for her that just because you have fear doesn't mean you should be ruled by it or controlled by it. Naheed was afraid. She understood what her parents were telling her, but she didn't see why they had to come all the way to New York City to show it. In many ways, she felt like she was constantly saying, I'm sorry for something she didn't do. Naheed and her family had as much in common with Islamist extremists as, well, nothing. There was nothing about her religion that was like that of the terrorists who had done this. But no one really seemed to understand that. There had been community rallies and outcries against the violence, but that hadn't changed anything. Wearing her hijab, which had once seemed an ordinary act, even if it sometimes got her unwanted attention, was now nothing less than a unifying act of faith and bravery. So Naheed used to be upset about the level of attention she got before. In the time following September 11th, that attention was much more intense. Naheed had worn her hijab to school the very next day. I am proud of you, her father told her. Courage is contagious. When one person of courage stands up, others are affected and will stand up with him. So her father recognizes that this is an act of bravery at that point, even if Naheed really didn't get the full grasp of it until she was at school. It was one thing to wear her religion on her sleeve, so to speak, at school, in the town where she had lived all her life, with kind teachers and a principal to help explain things. But coming here, to New York, to ground zero, that was a whole other kind of courage. Yet Naheed couldn't help being moved by the sights around her, and she forgot what others might be thinking when they saw her. Their mother handed each of the girls a stemmed blossom to slip into the chain-link fence. Naheed brought the flower to her face as she remembered that day, a year ago, when nothing else was important to her except fitting in, being like everyone else. Now, when she looked around at the crowd of people, all sharing the same moment, the same sadness, not one person was like any other. If she squinted her eyes, everyone, every single person, melted into a mix of shapes and colors. So this is a very salient point. It's an important point. No one is like anyone else on this planet. We may have similarities. We may have people we connect to. We may be told you take after your father, you take after your aunt, whatever. But in reality, each of us is our own unique self. And so the idea that loss or mourning or grief could belong only to one group, that's ridiculous. Everyone, not just Americans, everyone from those 90 countries that lost people on September 11th, everyone grieves on the anniversary of that event. And so Naheed, in that moment, is mature enough to recognize this is bigger than just her trying to fit in. This is bigger than her just wanting to be liked by her peers. This is a situation where people were united in that same feeling of loss. And while it was extremely sad, it was also extremely powerful in showing us how really connected we are to each other as human beings. What are you doing here? A mix of shapes and colors and a harsh, angry voice. Did you hear me? What are you people doing here? Was this voice talking to her? Naheed looked up. He was white. He was big. He held an American flag in one hand. He stood directly in front of Naheed and her mother and sister until her father stepped in front of his family. Amy heard it too, the angry voice. She couldn't get down to where the stage was set up, but she had made her way to the tall fence where people had hung photos, flowers, and stuffed animals. Anger sends out a strange energy, like a force field in a science fiction movie. It repels. So this is a simile, but this simile is an interesting observation. In a peaceful, mournful environment, this individual is angry, and that anger kind of shocks the people who are standing around. And in this moment, Amy is one of those people. Anger sends out a strange energy like a force field in a science fiction movie. It repels. It destroys. Amy felt it. I said, what are you people doing here? She turned to see whom the voice was talking to, where this hostility was directed to whom. We are here to honor those who died just like you are. A dark-skinned man answered. He spoke softly. He was with a woman and two girls, all three, with those colorful veils on their heads. Well, we don't want your kind here. Nobody does. Get out and take your Arab wife and kids with you. So, here it is. Racism. Bigotry. Xenophobia. This is the very worst of humanity right here. And it's born out of fear. It's born out of ignorance. And it's born out of a situation where somebody has no empathy. They have no ability to put themselves in someone else's position. This is somebody blaming others for pain and loss that they did not cause. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous when people descend into this level of hatred because they stop seeing other people as human beings and they start seeing them as punching bags. And so this is a very dangerous attitude that's being expressed right here. And it's something that as bystanders, we cannot allow to have persist. As bystanders, we cannot allow these levels of hatred to stand. And I think you'll see that handled by our other characters in this next section. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. It was scary and it was racist. Will could hear the lady playing the flute and the names being read slowly, one after the other in alphabetical order behind him. But this was New York City, right? Nobody did anything for anyone else in New York City. People were rude and unfriendly here, even if he hadn't experienced any of that himself. Except that man at the information booth at Penn Station had been pretty gruff. But somebody should do something. It's not somebody else's job, his father had taught him. It's all of our jobs. This was just a family. Maybe they had lost someone. Maybe that's why they were here, to let go, to heal, like everyone else. Will turned to see if his mother had heard it too, but it didn't look like she had. She was staring down at the proceedings and crying. Not falling apart, but crying. The girls were on either side of her, holding her skirt. So for Will, he hears this anger, and it's a call to action. Because his father had taught him, when he thinks, somebody should do something about this, it's not somebody's job, it's your job. If it bothers you, if you know it's wrong, then it's your job to stop it. It's your job to get involved. And if there's the right thing to do in the moment and you're capable of doing it, then you should do it. And so this is Will becoming involved. And he's not alone. Sergio noticed the father first. Then he recognized the anger and the familiar sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. The anger was coming from the huge white man who was waving his flag around. The father wasn't going to fight. Anyone could tell that. Anyone who had ever been in a fight could see that. He was leaning back, pressing his body against his wife and holding his arms behind him, creating a space where his family would be safe. He wasn't going to fight even if it came to that. We are not bothering anyone. We came here all the way from Ohio, the father said, to pay our respects. It wouldn't be much of a fight anyway. The father looked to be about 5'6", maybe 150 pounds, and this white dude could have been Ivan Drago from Rocky IV without the accent. Just so you know, Ivan Drago was a character in a movie called Rocky IV that was enormous, 6 foot plus, huge muscles. He was a boxer, and he was dangerous. Maybe the dad, who was there with his family, thought the other, bigger man would back away if he identified himself as being from Ohio, like Amy was from California. We are all Americans here. We're from Ohio, the father said again. I'm a physician. But the other guy didn't seem to care and didn't back away. He took another menacing step toward the family. Amy looked back to see if her mother and father were watching. Could they see? Was somebody going to help? Was anybody going to do something? And then suddenly, there were 2 boys, a white boy and a black boy, standing in front of the family. And then, a whole bunch of firemen in their blue FDNY t-shirts seemed to come out of nowhere to stand next to the boys. And then, a young mother with her baby strapped to the front of her body. She joined them. And then an old man and an old woman in matching plaid shirts, pinned with ribbons and buttons that said never forget, stood next to them. Until there were so many people standing in front of the family that Amy couldn't see them anymore. So, my friends, who is this? Come on, we know. This is Will. This is Sergio. If you had any doubts that that was Sergio, all these FDNY guys, this is Gideon and his friends. Okay? So, this is the moment where, as Americans, they pushed back. Not against the terrorist, but against the hatred inside our own country. They pushed back because there's enough hatred in the world. Because we need to have empathy. We need to have each other's back as human beings. We need to have compassion and understanding and tolerance and acceptance. We need all of these things. And these characters all stood up for it in this moment. All she could see was a sea of people who could not be more different, but could not be more the same, standing together. And what she could hear releasing into the air with the sounds of the flute were the names of those who had died in this very spot, remembered always, floating on the music of a warm September wind. So We have an author's note at the end. You are welcome to read it on your own. It explains that Nora Raleigh Baskin was not actually in New York City or Shanksville or Washington, D.C. She actually was in Connecticut. She was a mom, and that was where she was actually in her car when she heard about the events of September 11th. And so you can read a little bit about that if that's something that interests you. But I think what we have here is really a beautiful piece that weaves together the factual realities of that event and the fictional characters that represent the realities of so many families and so many people who endured this event. And so I thank you for reading this book with me. I know that this is not something that's part of your lifetime, but it's part of your history. But I do want to remind you that history does happen in our lifetimes, and that in this moment, you are part of history yourself. And so it might be an interesting idea to take up writing and create pieces that leave that history alive in the minds of others in your future.